Hello, I'm Tim Crouch. I was a commercial airline pilot for over 30 years, and during that time was actively involved in operational safety matters. Now, as an air accident investigator, my aim is not just to find out why we still occasionally have terrible air accidents, but to come up with methods and strategies to help prevent these same terrible accidents from happening again. Our mistakes are very visible and always in the public eye. Therefore, we have had to change the way we operate. And I would like to extend to you our support in helping you avoid unnecessary danger. In this program, we focus on non-technical skills, or human factors. In aviation, it was only when we fully integrated matters affecting human behavior into all our training courses that we finally managed to reduce our accidents and improve our operational safety record. Key to this is learning from the mistakes of others. Some of the accidents at sea are just as terrible as those in the air. People get injured, people get killed, and with maritime accidents, there's an additional factor, the damage to the environment. This series of programs is based upon real-life cases of accidents at sea. Actors may play some of the key roles, and much of what you're about to see has been reconstructed. But the stories are real and are based upon the actual findings of professional marine accident investigators. In this particular program, we're focusing on fatalities which occur as a result of entry into enclosed or confined spaces. Those of you routinely working with dangerous cargoes will be familiar with the dangers associated with enclosed spaces and the strict permit-to-work systems that must be in place as part of the ship's safety management system. These systems include atmosphere testing and, if necessary, provision of appropriate protective equipment. And procedures for entering and monitoring a recognized dangerous enclosed space must be strictly observed. The problem is, most of the accidents involving dangerous spaces happen because the danger is not recognized. The space has never been identified as being potentially dangerous, and because of that, no proper procedures are in place for working in them. Complacency? Simple lack of knowledge? Perhaps. What is certain, though, is that far too many people die as a result. Let's look at our first case study.
Concerned, the master asked the ABs to check that the main deck and the forward part of the vessel were secure. Satisfied that all was well, the master thanked the seamen and told them to stand down for the afternoon. The ABs didn't appear for lunch, but that was nothing unusual, and their food was left out for them. As far as the rest of the ship was concerned, the ABs were sleeping in their cabins. But when the two men didn't appear for dinner either, it became clear that something was probably wrong. The chief mate and watch engineer were instructed to carry out a search for the missing men. On arrival at the forward store, it became clear that the door was not locked as it should have been. And that wasn't all.
So what happened? Why did these men die? Quite why the two men went to the locker was never made clear. The most likely explanation is that they went to get tools to fix a problem in one of their cabins. What is clear is that they died very soon after entering the forward store. The post-mortem confirmed what killed them was oxygen depletion. They entered an enclosed space with an atmosphere so low in oxygen that it simply could not support life. But why? They'd been in that store only hours before, and there was no indication of any problem. All that had happened since then was the closing of the vents to prevent seawater getting in. But would that alone have caused such a dramatic loss of oxygen? There had to be another explanation. The cargo of steel turnings had been considered harmless. No special procedures required. But the cargo was wet. It is well known that steel turnings are, under certain circumstances, including wetness, liable to self-heat and ignite spontaneously. This process also leads to oxygen depletion. In other words, it should have been considered a dangerous cargo, but it wasn't. In fact, when the paper trail was examined and the actions of charterers, brokers, intermediaries, agents, and terminal operators considered, not once had there been any suggestion of a possible hazard. And there was something else. The master had received specific training in the carriage of dangerous goods in bulk. Maybe because of that training, he spotted what he thought was a problem during loading at his second port. When the hatch covers were opened, there was significant visible vapor coming from the steel turnings. But when the master voiced his concerns and asked for more specific details of the cargo, terminal personnel assured him that the vapor was quite common. Nothing dangerous, nothing to worry about. Another major factor was the cargo ventilation system, which should have dealt with any vapor. So why didn't it? Ventilation was provided at the forward and aft ends of the cargo hold. But within the hold, aft, it was discovered that shutters had been placed over the vents and the flaps secured with expanding foam and sealant. The forward ventilation ducts also had been fitted with wooden shutters, and attempts had been made to seal these too. The system led immediately into the forward store through extraction fans to the forward end, then out through mushroom vents on the main deck. All seemed to be in order. But it was when investigators looked at the bellows either side of the extraction fans that they made an astonishing discovery. 3 of the 4 bellows had been cut to create openings, which had been made to drain off seawater and cargo residue. But they did more than that. They created an open airway between the store and the cargo hold. As the steel turnings heated up, the oxygen in the cargo hold was consumed. That might have been the end of it, but due to the connecting airway, there was now air in the hold, which with oxygen levels of around 6% by volume, was able to flow into the forward store. The forward store had never been considered a hazardous space, but suddenly it became one. The men were unprepared. They did not anticipate the danger, and they died because of it. Accident investigation is not about blame. Its essential purpose is to determine the causes of accidents and produce recommendations to prevent their recurrence. So what were the main causes? The cargo was liable to self-heating. It should have been defined as such, but it wasn't. The requirements of the BC Code, the Code of Safe Practice for solid bulk cargoes, should have been followed, but they weren't. Shippers, brokers, managers and terminal operators should, between them, have ensured that the cargo was loaded in compliance with the BC Code, but they didn't. The master had received special training in the carriage of dangerous goods. Apart from being subject to the BC Code, the cargo was also defined as dangerous under the IMDG Code. The master should have known that. He should also have known that his document of compliance for the carriage of dangerous goods prevented him from carrying such a cargo. And even when the master spotted that something might be wrong, he readily accepted the assurances of others, instead of exercising his overriding authority in ensuring the safety of his ship and his crew. As in many accidents, one thing leads to another. The forward store had never been considered a dangerous enclosed space. But had the cargo been identified as hazardous, the BC Code advice would have suggested that spaces adjacent to the cargo holds could contain an unsafe atmosphere. In that situation, the master would have briefed the crew on the risks involved in entering the forward store. And that would have meant the two men were far more likely to have entered the forward store only after having taken the proper precautions. As for the ventilation system, it was clear that there were design deficiencies. Principally, the system was not capable of allowing the practical removal of seawater and cargo waste. But cutting into the bellows either side of the extraction fans compromised a class-approved system. It should never have been carried out. Worse, perhaps, is the fact that this modification was not picked up by routine inspections and audits. The system had clearly failed. In the end, what we have is a story of complacency, lack of awareness, lack of proper procedures. A story of two men who died unnecessarily, and it might have been even worse. The chief officer was the first to discover the two men lying at the bottom of the forward store. His experience, his training, should have stopped him from entering, but it didn't. As we have already established, the forward store was not and never had been considered a dangerous space. The chief officer was lucky. Another few seconds and his fate would have been the same. Human instinct can be immensely powerful, but it can also be immensely dangerous. Someone is in trouble. Someone else moves in to help. But in the majority of cases, the would-be rescuer simply becomes another victim. In our next case study, we're going to look at this battle between instinct and training, a battle which far too many people end up losing.
ERRVs, Emergency Response and Rescue Vessels, play an important part in providing emergency support to oil and gas platforms. For the master and 11 crew members, another 28-day rotation began on a Friday. Fresh from leave, the men were in good spirits. But for 3 of them, that wouldn't last for long. For 3 nights in a row, these men were disturbed by a banging anchor chain in the spurling pipe. On this particular morning, it was agreed that something had to be done. Barnes was 40, Solanke 38, and McWilliams 57. All had been with the company for a number of years. All were experienced seamen. McWilliams joined the master on the bridge to take the watch. He mentioned the problem with the anchor chain and told him that the other two men had requested permission to sort the problem out. The master agreed, although it was never made clear that the master knew exactly what he was agreeing to. In any event, no instructions were given. A few hours later, Barnes and Solanke set off for the chain locker. All they carried with them was a VHF radio. The hatches leading to the chain locker were found underneath duckboards. Each hatch was tightly sealed and secured with 18 bolts. What actually happened next will never be known. The most likely explanation is that Barnes entered the locker first. Within seconds, he collapsed. Seeing Barnes suddenly on the floor, Solanke quickly radioed the bridge. In spite of all the training, Solanke was unable to resist trying to save his friend. Within seconds, he too suffered the same fate. McWilliams also forgot or decided to ignore the procedures for raising the alarm. One possibility is that Solanke had indicated his intention to try a rescue on his own, and McWilliams simply wanted to get to the scene as quickly as possible and stop him. Recognizing that putting on full breathing apparatus would make entry difficult, McWilliams decided to use an EEBD, an emergency escape breathing device. It was another error of judgment, the last McWilliams would ever make.
When the three men were finally pulled out of the locker, they were already dead. So why did these men enter a dangerous space without following proper procedure? Why were they allowed to? What killed the men was oxygen deficiency, resulting from excessive rust in the chain locker. It is a well-known fact that the rusting process absorbs oxygen, and the levels of oxygen in the locker were thought to have been as low as 4%, which would cause immediate fainting, followed very quickly by asphyxiation. A level of 21% oxygen is the minimum content to assure survival. It rapidly became clear to the investigators that no one on board was familiar with this particular lethal process. But there was some recognition, at least, that the locker itself was an enclosed space, which posed potential danger and thus required precautions to be taken. But this sign, probably made on board, was considered by the investigators as not being a substitute for a proper, effective permit-to-work system. And the fact that it was given such a low priority simply compounded the problem. But what about the routine inspections, the company audits? Surely these should have identified the fact that here was an obvious deficiency, a clear breach of the onboard safety management system. It should have been identified long before, but it wasn't. Something else that an inspection should have picked up was the fact that entering the chain locker at sea had certainly been carried out on a number of previous occasions. There was even some helpful advice posted as to the precise tool to be used for removing the hatch bolts. And inside the locker itself, evidence of previous attempts to tie off the banging anchor chain. But because there had been no problems in the past, the potential risks were soon forgotten. Something that started out as a one-off exception had become everyday practice. As far as the investigators were concerned, this was a particularly important point, as a company policy stated that entry into enclosed spaces while at sea was forbidden. They were only to be entered when the vessel was in port. Clearly, the company view was that there was no need to enter enclosed spaces while at sea, a wholly unrealistic rule. It was another example of system failure, or, as the investigators termed it, a disconnect between office policy and actual shipboard operations. Other failures included ignoring procedures and ignoring the crucial lessons learned in training. Investigators discovered that all members of the crew had been briefed about the dangers of enclosed spaces and had received training, including being shown the correct procedures for atmosphere testing, safe entry, and the dangers involved in rushing in regardless. But as we have already demonstrated, human instinct is powerful. The training had also included the use of protective equipment, such as breathing apparatus. But the training concerning the EEBD, Emergency Escape Breathing Device, was insufficient. In fact, no practical drills involving the EEBD had ever been carried out. No instruction as to its limitations ever given. The device is limited to 10 minutes duration. Strenuous activity places additional demands on the need for air, which the unit may not be able to provide. It is for these reasons that the EEBD is an escape-only device. It should never be used for entering into a dangerous atmosphere. When rescuers recovered McWilliams, the face mask had been dislodged. Quite why was never properly established. The most likely reason is that McWilliams, desperate for more air, took the mask off to take a deep breath. It would have been his last. As in our first case study, another example of wasted human life. And we could show you many more examples involving passenger ships, cargo ships, other support vessels, and other bulk carriers. Recent research suggests that over the last 10 years, around 1,000 seafarers have lost their lives in entering dangerous enclosed spaces. So what do we need to do? How can we stop this from happening? How, as I suggested at the beginning of this program, can we learn from our mistakes? We can start by being aware that legislation exists and should be followed. But we should also be aware that legislation alone is not enough to stop these accidents. We need to recognize that we all have an important part to play. Owners and operators have a responsibility to promote safety awareness, to create a culture on both ship and shore within which all risks are identified and a positive attitude taken towards their control. Safety management systems on board should be effective. They should be continuously reviewed and updated. They should be relevant to shipboard operations and take into account all possibilities. And inspections should be frequent. Audits should be thorough. Anything unusual should be noted, then acted upon. Anything different cargo, a different method of working, for example, should be considered in terms of any potential danger and risk assessment. Instruction and training are crucial elements. Here again, training should be effective and relevant to shipboard operations. Training and instruction must also ensure that the dangers of rushing in instinctively are clearly understood. We must all be aware of the dangers posed by entry into enclosed spaces, and we must all do everything we can to avoid making the same mistakes. While the procedures required may be complex, we should remember, procedures protect. They have been designed to ensure our safety. It is essential that we all take personal responsibility for our own safety. Safety is not simply something that exists. People actively create safety through their cautious thoughts and actions. The human is very resourceful, and this is the individual role we all play in ensuring safe operations, from the boardrooms to on board our ships. It means being constantly aware. It means questioning and speaking up if we sense something is wrong. If we are uncertain, it means following that uncertainty through. It also means looking out for the safety of others.